your source for Orthodox books, podcasts, videos, and more. We are Ancient Faith Ministries.
He will be a staff for the righteous with which for them to stand and not to fall. And he will be the light of the nations and the hope of those whose hearts are troubled. All who dwell on the earth will fall down and worship him, and they will praise and bless and celebrate with song the Lord of spirits. 1 Enoch chapter 48, verses 4 through 5. The modern world doesn't acknowledge, but is nevertheless haunted by spirits, angels, demons, and saints. In our time, many yearn to break free of the prison of a flat, secular materialism, to see and to know reality as it truly is. What is this spiritual reality like? How do we engage with it well? How do we permeate everyday life with spiritual presence? Orthodox Christian priests, Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung, host this live call-in show focused on enchantment in creation, the union of the seen and unseen as made by God and experienced by mankind throughout history. Welcome to the Lord of Spirits.
Good evening, giant killers, dragon slayers, demon dodgers, and hammerers of homunculi. You are listening to the Lord of Spirits podcast. My co-host, Father Stephen DeYoung, is with me from Lafayette, Louisiana, and I am Father Andrew Stephen Damick in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, in the beautiful Lehigh Valley. And we are live. And if you are listening to us live, you can call us at 855-237-2346, and you can talk to us. We're going to get your calls in the second half of the show, and our very own Matuszka Trudy will be taking those calls.
Before the commercial,
that
news station identification, right?
Yes,
like right before our
with the voice
rolled.
of Trudy.
Yeah. Is we her new preferred pronoun?
Wow.
I don't want to commit any microaggressions while we're recording this. I thought I'd clarify that before we go live. Oh,
it's the editorial.
Never mind. Oh, okay.
The royal. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for clearing that up. So this episode is sponsored by the Orthodox Studies Institute at St. Constantine College, which exists to advance the study and application of Orthodox Christianity and faithfulness to Holy Tradition. OSI is currently offering a live online course on the Book of Enoch, taught by our very own Father Stephen DeYoung. The course is underway, but by popular demand, OSI has reopened registration, and you can catch up on the recordings of earlier classes and participate in the live classes going forward. So to learn more and to register, go to orthodoxstudies.org/LOS. Registration is now open also for OSI's next course, which is Holy Women of Byzantium, and that's going to begin in October. So again, go to orthodoxstudies.org/LOS to learn more about the Enoch course.
And on Tuesday night, a participant described this course as Lord of Spirits in a suit and tie. Although I do not, in fact, wear a suit and tie.
I mean, do you even own a suit and tie?
I own a suit. I don't think I own a tie anymore. I've been a priest for more than 15 years. I think I no longer own a tie.
Yeah. So, well, in the long ago times, there was something called the Stone Age. And this is generally divided into the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic periods, which just means old, middle, and new, people. It is this last period from which archaeology tells us something about ancient religion. But what does this have to do with Christianity? And how should we understand the continuity of religion from that most ancient of detectable prehistory to the Orthodox Christianity of our own day? And we should probably start with asking what religion is, though. So I'm assuming everybody agrees on what religion is?
Pretty much.
Oh. That's the first half is gone. So.
Yeah, there we go. We can roll
go ahead and go to break.
Oh, yeah. Well, I also want you to know, I don't know if you actually prepared for this evening. I did by eating my own version of the paleo diet today.
Nice.
So for lunch, I had a pound of bacon and 2 fingers of scotch. I said my version.
I had breakfast for dinner, which feels pretty paleo.
Well, it depends on what kind of breakfast. Are we talking steak and eggs or?
Eggs and sausage.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
Was it the cheap sausage with lots of filler?
No. This actually comes from a farm out in Western Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So yeah.
You're doing all right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So we are, there was kind of a confluence of Lord of Spirits tropes for tonight's episode. Because on one hand, we like to start episodes in the Stone Age. But on the other hand, our topic tonight is the Stone Age, and everyone knows we don't get to our topic until the third half.
Waves of disappointment are now flowing through YouTube.
Yes, right. So which one of those would take effect? Well, the latter. So fair warning, we will, as typical, get to our actual topic in the third half. But until then, we will be laying groundwork.
Yeah.
And as
comic books, Star Trek, whatever else.
Yes, as Father Andrew alluded, we're going to start by talking about what religion is anyway. Right? Because you say the term religion, and everybody kind of thinks they know what that means. But if you press people about what that means, often people can't tell you exactly what that means, in the sense of trying to give a definition, trying to say, okay, this is what religion is.
Yeah, especially something that's going to fit all of the things that we regard as being religions.
As being religious, but then also exclude all the things that we generally don't think of as being religious.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So that's actually a lot trickier, right, than it sounds. And even the people who talk about religion the most, and by that I mean atheists on the internet, can't come up with a good definition of what religion is, and therefore we could safely say those folks don't know what they're talking about. But and a lot of these arguments, you'll hear these sort of broad statements from the Fedora gang, saying things like, well, religion is responsible for all the war, hate, bad things, expired lunch meat in the world, right? Like, it's just religion. If we just get rid of religion, right, then we'd live in this beautiful utopia, right, of wonder. And by
enlightenment. Wow.
Yeah. And by this, I mean, everyone from edgy teens to Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. Right?
It's true. I mean, it's true.
Make these kind of broad, unsupported, frankly childish statements. So, and again, when pressed, right, what's religion and what isn't?
Yeah.
So
I remember back in the late Neolithic era when you and I were undergrads, which I know for you lasted a good 2 months or whatever.
It was a little less than 3 calendar years.
There we go.
Didn't
you start your undergrad when you were 16 or something like that? Is that right?
Yeah.
A little bit later for me. I mean, I remember I actually took a class in philosophy of science, and the whole beginning of the class was the professor essentially eviscerating every definition that a student could come up with that said religion is on this side and science is on this side. And as I told you earlier today, I don't remember the particulars of that class because, again, it was in the late Neolithic period. But I did come away with a very beautiful sense of, okay, this game is not like what the Fedora clan, make it out to be.
Right.
Although we're edgy atheists in the early 90s wearing fedoras. Or more they're really kind of trilbies, actually, I think, not actual fedoras.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm trying to think the atheists I knew. See, those were the old atheists, right? The guys I'm describing are the quote unquote new atheists.
New atheists, yeah, that's true.
And old atheists were just a better class of atheists. Right? I mean, especially if you go real old school, like your Nietzsche, your...
Oh, yeah, that guy actually didn't believe in things.
Yes, that's right. There were some top-level atheists, back in the late 19th and early 20th century, And then, really, I think the first, edgelord, publicity-seeking atheist who, public atheist to sell books and file annoying nuisance lawsuits was Madalyn Murray O'Hair.
Oh, yes.
Remember her?
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed.
Who had an interesting personal life. But yeah, she was on Phil Donahue's show talking about how God doesn't exist, which was a super edgy thing to do, even on Phil Donahue's show, like in the 80s.
Wow.
So yeah, a lot of atheists were in the closet then, at least in the U.S. I think in Europe they were more free to, but they also didn't have the same chip on their shoulder in Europe. I think in Europe they just weren't religious.
Yeah,
they didn't feel the need to badger anyone about it.
A lot of the new atheist stuff was really not about like presenting any kind of new or better arguments. It was like, okay, let's all point and laugh. Honestly.
Yes. I don't have a religion, but all I'm going to do every day is think about and post about religion. Yeah. Yes. So, yeah, but
whatever religion is.
Yeah, whatever that, sort of is, and if you ever tried to argue with those people, which I did in the early days of the internet when the system of tubes had just been connected, before I realized it was pointless, you would get these interesting things, because they would say things like, well, non-religious people never go and murder religious people for being religious. And you'd bring up, say, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, right? Lenin, I would get two responses. One, I literally had an atheist once tell me that Lenin's League of the Militant Godless was not a militant atheist organization. Which was fascinating, right?
Doesn't do what it says on the tin.
Yeah, exactly. It's a sham. But more common was they would say that communism or Marxism is a religion.
Wow.
Right. So any bad ideology that they don't like, even if it was just as atheistic as them, they would try and say, well, that ideology is a religion or is religion. So basically everything except science as they understand it. And of course, they'd taken like 3 science classes at high school. So, but, yeah. So even there, they would get used in a slippery way in the other direction. Right. And there were Christian apologists doing that too. Josh McDowell at one point published a book called Secular Religions.
Oh, man.
Where he described like secular humanism and communism and fascism as religions.
Yeah.
So, that's not everything I don't like is religion. That was more, in his case, I think he was trying to argue that just everybody is religious. Like people won't admit it.
I mean, that's basically kind of valid on a certain
level. So, yeah. So then you argue, well, okay, you're a whatever. So that's really your religion and Christianity's better than that one. Right. I think was the approach he was trying to take, at that point. So where does the word religion come from? Because it's a relative latecomer to English, but it's developed from a Latin word.
Yeah, it's only from the early 13th century in English, and I don't have the jingle to play. Sorry, everybody.
Which is
I'm not going to do a whole
Latin word.
Yeah, exactly. Late for even a Latin word. And when it comes into English, it's literally from day one, it's being used to describe like people who live in a monastery.
Yes, religious.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Which sounds like a funny way of using it now. Like, especially Catholics talk about the religious, and by that they mean monks and nuns and so forth. But that is the oldest use of it in English is that. But the idea is that they're sort of, bound to this particular life, right? Which is probably where the Latin religio comes from.
Yeah. People argue about this because, journal articles, dissertations.
Yeah.
But the majority opinion, a large majority opinion, is that it comes from, it's the prefix re in front of ligio, which is the same root as ligature, which means to tie or bind something.
And in this case, the re is an intensifier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's something that binds something together, and that fits right, with how religion is used. For example, as we've talked about a lot on the show, one of the main purposes of religious ritual, or ritual in general, is to bind together groups of people, to maintain, establish, reestablish when broken bonds within a community and between a community and its god or gods. So that seems a very apt, right, origin for the term, even if we can't 100% prove it. Now, before that, though, right, we start seeing it used in Latin very early in Latin literature. So Cicero uses it, though, in a weird way by our current standards. But I mean, later on, St. Augustine uses it. I mean, it's in Latin. It is a Latin term, albeit one whose meaning shifts over time, like all terms. Before that, though, you're talking about various words that we now translate with some version of piety, which is based on a different Latin word, right? So you're not going to find, in Greek literature, for example, there's not really a word for religious, right? There are sometimes people will translate certain Greek words, like in the New Testament, as religious. But really, if they translate those words consistently everywhere they translate them, it ends up being something like pious, piety, right?
Yeah, which is like pius in Latin is sort of like dutiful, basically.
Right. And so, and piety, that's covering the Greek sevasti, which has a similar idea. The idea is that this is an ethical, piety is an ethical quality, right? So we think of piety or religiosity as this sort of accessory that someone may or may not have right in their life.
Yeah. He's very pious.
Yeah. And then some people are less pious and some people aren't at all, right? But it was considered a sort of ethical virtue, right alongside things like courage and honor and dealing justly, right? What made you a good person, part of that was piety, particularly in the Roman sphere, which is why we get the word piety to translate it. It was, a sense of honoring all of your duties.
Yeah. I mean, just read the Aeneid if you need to know what the Roman idea of piety is. Like Aeneas is the pious guy in Roman legend.
Whereas in Greek circles, it was more seen as another way in which a great man could display his excellence, right? But Aristotle, for example, will argue that piety, like everything, is a mean between two extremes. So someone can, for Aristotle, be too pious. Think religious extremist, I guess.
I don't know. Sacrificing one too many goats.
Yeah. Right. Well, I don't know. I think it would more be, I think for him, you'd probably be talking about someone who is like overly obsessed with augury or something, right? Like who,
yeah.
To the point that it detracted from their life or something, right?
I've met people like that.
That's augurs.
Mostly on the internet.
Yeah.
People obsessed with augury. Yeah.
But so like when St. Paul says to the people of Athens, it's translated often, I see that you're very religious, right? He's talking about the fact that he sees all these idols and all these shrines, right? He says, it means I see you take these things very seriously.
Yeah.
Right. This is something you've invested time and effort as a community in, right? This is something that is of concern to you, right? And so they would have received that as a compliment, right? Like, I see that you are very courageous, or I see that you are very just, right? The same kind of, so that, it's important to kind of understand this idea of religion or religiosity in the ancient world, but that doesn't really help us define religion too much.
No, because, we're pointing at a certain set of various sets of behaviors. I shouldn't say a certain set of behaviors, various sets of behaviors, and we're calling all that stuff religion.
Right. Yeah. We're talking about some property of a human who has some dutifulness, right, or diligence about something.
Yeah. Within Greek paganism, it's duty to the gods.
Yeah.
But that's not the only religion in the world.
And that can take various forms.
Oh, yeah.
Various times in various places that are radically different. Right. So we've talked before on the show about how our definition of religion, as we think about it as modern post-enlightenment people, which we all are, whether we like it or not, is very much tied up with the concept of religions, or that there is such a thing as a religion, right? There are these various individual religions out there. And then if we're going to talk about religion in general, right, then religion is the genus, and then there are all these species, right, of religions with underneath that.
With
right?
groupings.
Underneath those. Yeah. That's, and that is a very new way of thinking. So the idea of a religion really starts being spoken of in the 17th century.
Yeah, when ancient people encountered people that we would regard as being from a different religion, they could certainly see that there's a difference between them, right? But it was more like, these are your ways, these are our ways. You serve those gods, we serve these gods. Yeah. That was the way that they conceived it. It wasn't like, oh, I have this religion and you have that religion.
Yes. I practice Greek paganism and you practice, Indian paganism, right? Or Persian paganism or Egyptian paganism, right? Because that's not how they thought of it, right? It was, those are your gods, these are my gods. Your gods want you to do XYZ for them. My gods want me to do XYZ for me, right? And there was a little bit of, our gods are better than your gods.
Sure.
Especially from the Greeks. Because the Greeks, even though their gods were originally theriomorph, for example, are always accusing Egyptians and Indians of worshiping animals. This proves that our religion is more refined. But what they meant by that was, we understand the divine better than they do.
Yeah.
Not, we have a different religion and our religion is better than theirs and we want to try to convert them to ours.
Yeah, that was... Yeah.
That was not a thing, right? But so the prerequisite in thought for talking about a religion is that there has to be a concept of religion in which religion is an element of human life or human culture that is separable from other elements of human life and human culture. And this is how we're used to thinking about it, right, as modern people. So you have your religion, that's like one basket. You have your politics, that's another basket. You have your, ethnic identity, that's another basket, right? And there may be connections between these baskets. In fact, people would probably argue all of these are connected, but they really are different baskets, right? And especially when you look at after the 30 Years' War in Europe. Right? So the 30 Years' War wrecks Europe, kills like a third of the people. And then after the 30 Years' War, right, and Catholics and Protestants have finished, for the time being, killing each other and don't want to kill each other anymore. And they take a break from killing like Jewish people and other minorities. Short break, but right. They say to prevent this from happening again, we need to reconceive of what binds us together as a people.
Yeah, the sort of idea of kind of the secular space on some level is born.
Right.
You have this identity of being, Prussian or something like that, that is above your quote unquote religion.
Right. And so it shifts to nationalism.
Yeah.
Right. It shifts to nationalism. Instead of, the center of my identity, it's the center of someone's identity being a Roman Catholic, it becomes they are a Frenchman.
Yeah.
Right. And so someone can be a Frenchman and be Roman Catholic. Someone can be a Frenchman and be Jewish. Someone can be a Frenchman and be Protestant. Right. They had to reconsider this so that, right, they didn't have to, try and kill all the Protestants. Right. Or in Protestant countries, kill all the Roman Catholics. Right. And so it's identity formed. And this is, you could definitely see this kind of thinking at the forefront in the United States today.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Right.
We're Americans, first of all.
Yeah. And then we have all kinds of different religions and different practices, and different cultures, but we're all Americans. And that's what's really important. Right. And what that does is, right, that shift of identity then relativizes religions, cultures, political views, all of these other things, ethical views, right? And turns them into these baskets, these ancillary baskets into which different things can be put.
Yeah, and you get this idea that religion can be a private matter.
Right.
That kind of thing.
So you have this religion socket, right? And you can plug all these different things in the socket. And once you have that idea that it's a socket with different things you could plug into the socket, then all of those potential plugins, right, get referred to as religions. Right, as religions. And so that means, and it was mainly the Europeans doing this, right? This means that, for example, we're going to talk about a religion, Hinduism. And we're going to talk about it like it's an organized religion. Right? Yeah. And for people who don't know, the term Hinduism is just a catch-all. It literally means the religion of the people of the Indus River Valley.
Yeah, it's not a religion. It's just sort of, it's a whole big collection of traditions of over 1 billion people, most of which are super local.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you get, and we could say the same thing, right, about, I mean, we don't think of it this way, but you could say the same thing about Greek religion.
Yeah.
Right. We've kind of thrown everything into this big paganism pile, right? But the Hinduism is a religion. Buddhism is a religion, right? And then, the Europeans taxonomize like as if there were denominations of Buddhism. Right? That had split off or something, as if it was Protestantism, right?
Yeah.
There's Zen Buddhism, and there's Theravada Buddhism, and there's, and so all these things just sort of get normalized. And then once you have that, right? So once we have this idea that there are these different religions that could all be sort of hooked up or that people could choose between, you get the whole concept of comparative religions, right? And the problem with comparative religion, the idea of comparative religion, is not that, you can't compare things. You can compare any two things.
Sure.
You can compare a raven and a writing desk. You can compare chalk and cheese, right? There are no two things that you cannot compare to one another. The problem is that in order to compare things, you have to have some kind of structure in order to perceive commonalities. So if I was going to write an essay comparing chalk and cheese, right, I would have to try to find things that chalk and cheese have in common. That's tricky, right? But in order to do that, I'd have to do a couple things. Number one, I would probably have to make those comparisons really broad and not detailed. Right? Like, most chalk is yellow or white. Most cheese is yellow or white. Right? Which is sort of so vague, it doesn't tell you anything about chalk or anything about cheese, really. Right? So how helpful is that comparison at that point? Right? Because it's so vague. So that's the first thing that happens. Or you make a comparison in some way that sort of does a little violence to either chalk or cheese. You could bite off a piece of chalk and you could bite off a piece of cheese.
Many of us out there have done so. No.
Technically true.
Yeah.
Right? But biting off a piece of chalk and biting off a piece of cheese are two fundamentally different experiences. Right? And so again, you're kind of having to fudge a little on the side of the chalk, right, in order to make this comparison. And so again, how helpful or useful is that comparison at this point? Right? And so this is what you find with comparative religion, right? You find a lot of square pegs getting beaten into round holes. I think I've mentioned this before on the show, but you see this a lot around Christmas and around Pascha, around Nativity and around Pascha. Here's all the ways that the story of Jesus is ripped off from fill in the blank pagan story.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And first of all, most of them aren't even true.
Right.
Right. Like you get this Mithras had 12 disciples stuff. There's literally citation needed. Like,
yeah,
there is no source for that. Right. But even the ones that are true, right? Like you'll get the list of people who had a virgin birth. Right. And invariably when you get that, one of the people on the list is Adonis. Right. And for those who don't know, the way Adonis was born was Zeus was wandering around one day on his way to probably commit sex crimes. And
as Zeus does,
as is his wont, and he decides to pleasure himself. Okay. And from the place where he does that, a tree grows.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
I should have given a parental warning at the beginning of this episode.
Maybe. I don't know. I think those were vague enough terms. And so then years later, a young woman is sitting under the tree. A piece of fruit falls off of the tree and lands in her lap, and she gets pregnant and gives birth to Adonis.
And that's just like in the New Testament, right?
Yes, that is exactly like Luke 2. Like you can clearly see how St. Luke stole that to describe Jesus' birth, right? So you see what I'm saying? This is an example, right? We go so vague, right? Someone who is born without their parents having participated in conjugal relations, right? And then we may say, oh, see, look, Jesus and Adonis, right? But then how helpful is that comparison when you actually read the two stories?
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't do justice to either of the two stories, right? And it just is kind of absurd, right? But this is because we've got, well, Christianity is a religion and Greek paganism is a religion, right? So we can sort of chart out and see, how they're similar. This also, and relatedly, this is where you start getting the sort of taxonomies of religion. And the taxonomies of religion kind of take two forms. One form is, well, okay, we're gonna group things together that we've decided are similar. Right? So you get these big categories like monotheism, which again, it's in the 17th century when people start using that word in Europe.
Yeah, see episode 1 of the Lord of the Rings podcast.
Even though they're Greek words, monos and theos, right? So the church fathers could have talked about monotheism all day if they wanted to, but they didn't use the term. There's monotheism and there's polytheism, right? So here's two categories, and all the religions that we're going to say, for the sake of argument, only have one God, right? We're going to put the monotheism category. Like, what do you do with Ahura Mazda? What do you do? Anyway. And then all these other pagan religions where they talk about lots of gods, we're going to put those over in the polytheism category, right? And you start getting these groupings like, the Abrahamic religions.
Yeah.
Right? That somehow involve Abraham, right? I'll get grouped over here, right? And you sort of group together things that you think are alike, right? But again, your decision that they're alike is based on these sort of bad, awkward comparisons in a lot of cases, right? And then also you start getting the taxonomies, which lead inevitably to the 19th century German conclusion that all of human religion has culminated in 19th century German Lutheranism.
I feel like I've heard that somewhere before.
Yeah, because, starting with the most primitive, religion, the most primitive polytheism, right? In their taxonomies, the crudest, most idolatrous, polytheism, working their way up to the stately cadence of the German chorale, right? And so once we have these idea of these discrete religions, we could chart them into this evolutionary framework of, religion becoming more and more refined until it inevitably leads to us, whoever us is. I guess earlier in the show, Trudy is the us.
Trudy is the height of all human religion.
Trudy is the pinnacle of human development, apparently. Self-proclaimed. That's what's crazy.
Wow.
Right. And so that's descriptive. All that we just talked about is kind of descriptive, right? In terms of what has happened and how the term religion and religions came into use and are used. That doesn't really help us understand what religion is, though, right? Because as we just talked about, a lot of the fruit of those taxonomies and comparative religion are unhelpful and phony, right? And do violence to the actual religious expressions that they're talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, and just to kind of like sometimes people will say things like, well, religion is about God, but there are religions that don't have any kind of God figure, or, religion
the way
is about,
we think of God. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They don't, religion is about spiritual things. Well, I mean, not that you should ever take Scientology seriously, and never take it seriously. I mean, it does seriously bad things. Yeah. But you should not take it as religion.
Never give them money.
Yeah, definitely never give them money. But like their whole deal is sort of using this kind of scientific
science
ish, to measure things. Like the whole thing is like that they're kind of a non-spiritual religion. Anyway.
Let me tell you, as somebody who's read all 10 volumes of Mission Earth, L. Ron Hubbard was not even a good sci-fi author.
Why did you do that? That I need to know.
I was really bored one summer.
Like really bored, and
they had all of them at the local library.
Wow. I remember the ads for Dianetics in the 1980s, like with the volcano and all that kind of stuff. Dianetics.
Yeah. I mean, you're 14 years old, you could only afford so many comic books to read.
And your judgment is not that great at 14.
And it's just like, I'm going to read sci-fi novels. And, you've gone through the classics. You've gone through Ray Bradbury. You've gone through Isaac Asimov. You're running out of stuff, right? There's a long summer yawning out ahead of you. What are you to do?
The summer Father Stephen hit rock bottom.
Yeah, you say whatever. And by book 6 of Mission Earth, trust me, you're like, why am I reading this? This is horrible.
But
even as a 14-year-old.
Finish it.
But now you're 6 books in out of 10. 60% is a failing grade, right? Like you can't just stop now.
If you
for
win
a penny and for a pound.
If you win at L. Ron Hubbard novels, aren't you failing at life?
I don't know. I don't know, but I finished them, and even if you like bad sci-fi novels, I am not recommending them because they are in places literally pornographic.
Yeah, they're not so bad they're good. They're just so bad they're bad.
Yeah, they're just bad. Like L. Ron Hubbard was clearly just a giant, weird, dysfunctional id, like pouring out his weirdest and deepest thoughts and fantasies onto a page.
Could it be Thetans?
Yeah. So, yeah. But technically, they're a religion, I guess. They have 501c3 status, I think, still.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
although in some countries they're not a religion legally.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway.
Yeah. In wiser countries, perhaps. So there's also a major pitfall here that we have to avoid as we're trying to come up with some kind of working definition of what religion is, right? And that pitfall is one that almost everyone falls into when they start talking about this, and that is that they see religion in general in terms of their own religious background.
Yeah, they define other religions to be like whatever they're used to, but just sort of trade out some details.
Right. And so this leads to innumerable misunderstandings. If you've ever had serious conversations with someone of another religion, even if we're talking about religious stuff that at one point was very close, like trying to talk to an Orthodox Jewish person, right? One of the big obstacles is going to be that they're going to understand Christianity through the lens of rabbinical Judaism. And you, if you're a Christian, are going to kind of understand Judaism through the lens of Christianity. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, like one really common thing, for instance, is especially, frankly, within Protestantism, there's this idea of defining religion in terms of beliefs, right? And it's funny, I remember, this isn't true anymore, but I remember the day that I that I discovered that Facebook was Protestant, because it said you could define your religious views. I'm like, religious views? These are my views.
Yeah. But you'll see a lot of that, even in older textbook, right? Here are the core beliefs or core tenets of Hinduism. Here are the core tenets of Islam.
Yeah. Right? Or even the idea that, like, well, everybody's trying to get salvation and they just have different ideas about how you get there. I'm like, no, they're not. The goals of different religions are very different from each other.
Yeah. And calling it salvation, you have to do one of those really broad comparisons where you're looping in things that are very unlike.
Yeah.
And calling them the same. Yeah.
A Hindu yogin, salvation for him is being released from, embodied selfhood and becoming not only disembodied, but no longer a self. That's quote unquote salvation within that context. That is a very different goal than your local Baptist and what he's trying to achieve when he goes to church on Sunday. Especially
if he knows about the bodily resurrection.
Right.
He's looking forward to eternal life.
Yeah.
They're kind of opposites. Yeah. And the whole beliefs thing, right? Again, that's, if you believe XYZ, boom, you're a Hindu. No, you're not. Right? You believe XYZ. Oh, now you're a member of Shinto. No, you're not. Sorry, basement dwelling weeb, right? Just because you read some stuff about Japan and decided you wanted to be Shinto, that doesn't make you Shinto. Right?
No, it does not.
And, just because you read one book about Haile Selassie, you are not a Rastafarian now. Right? It's not just a question of, I think these are good ideas, therefore I am now a blank. Right?
Yeah.
And you also get, in these discussions, you'll see, especially again from, and when we say, we're not just saying, oh, Protestants do this. We're saying people from a Protestant religious background, people who live in Protestant countries, even if they're not religious, right, tend to think about religion in these ways because it's sort of the majority religion of their country, right?
Yeah.
they'll talk about, these are the sacred texts, right? So like Christians have the Bible and Jewish people just have the Old Testament and Muslims have the Quran and Hindus have like the Vedas or the Bhagavad Gita or something. Right? As if these texts and Taoists have the Tao Te Ching, right? And these are all just these books all just function the same way in all of these quote unquote religions that the Bible functions for an American evangelical Protestant, right? In their mind. And this is like, no, right? Of course not. And it's one of the most amazing things in the world. On the interwebs, right? And you can see this any day of the week. If you watch an atheist arguing with a Christian, right? The atheist will take like the most fundamentalist possible literal interpretation of every verse of scripture.
Yes.
Right? And the Christian of whatever stripe arguing with him will desperately try to explain, like, look, no one reads it that way.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's not right. No one thinks it means that. No one reads it that way. Right? And get super frustrated. But then if that same Christian goes and talks to a Muslim, he will take the most fundamentalist possible literal interpretation of any verse of the Quran.
Yeah.
Right? While the Muslim tries to explain, nobody reads it that way. Right. And it's because both that Christian and that atheist are Americans. And so evangelical Christianity is what's around them.
Yeah, I mean,
and so they just assume that that's how everyone reads their sacred text.
Yeah, and also just the intellectual habit of reductionism.
Yeah.
You know, which is a bad habit, people.
Yes. Yeah. And on the other side, to be fair, so they can't say, I mean, the U.S. is a majority Protestant and majority evangelical Protestant country, right? But you'll see this sometimes with high church Protestants and Roman Catholics and even some Orthodox people, where they'll talk about other religions in terms of like hierarchical structures, right? Yeah. Like they try to make the Dalai Lama like the Pope of Buddhism or something. Like,
I did notice one time though that maybe this is how it works. That I actually did a little survey of media that's talking about religion, and I found out that at least American media uses the phrase "His Holiness" more often for the Dalai Lama than they do for Pope for the Pope. I was like, that's really kind of interesting. They're using this indirect honorific for, you know, this religious leader and not for the one who's actually probably more familiar using that title. It's pretty funny. I don't know.
I think Protestant America is more deeply anti-Catholic than they are deeply anti-Buddhist.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Plus, you have the whole liberal, well, that's another culture.
Yes. Right.
Element of.
Right. Oh, right. That's how they call him.
Yeah. Whereas most popes are white people. So that's. Yeah. So there are all kinds of those misunderstandings, right? And they go in all ways. Okay. So what can we come up with as a definition of religion that is both workable, right? Meaning there aren't obvious massive flaws in it, right? Obvious massive flaws would be excludes some things that are obviously religious.
Yes.
Or includes some things that obviously aren't.
Yeah, like the classic example would be saying, well, religion is about how you relate to God or gods, and people saying, okay, well then Buddhism is not a religion because it's sort of non-theistic. Therefore, it's a philosophy. But
yeah,
I mean, take a look at any kind of Buddhist practice, people. And I don't mean
burning incense, man.
I don't mean California Buddhism. Okay, I mean Buddhism and where it's native, and that is clearly a religion. Just look at it. Just look at it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Richard Gere's pool parties are not actual Buddhist rituals.
I know there's probably a lot of disappointed people out there that just
I know
like what
I know.
What?
You're like, that means I've never been to church. And then, but also a working definition, meaning a definition that's actually useful for something, right? That's not like so vague in some way in order to not transgress those limits that there's nothing to be derived from it, right? So here's what we're proposing tonight, right? As sort of a working and workable definition of religion, that religion is a way of being in the world that encompasses all levels of reality and expresses itself in practices.
Okay.
So there's three sort of key parts there.
Yeah.
Right. The first one is talking about a way of being in the world, right? Because, and the reason it's phrased that way is that we want to get away from the idea of thought or ideas or beliefs, right? That could be included in a way of being in the world, but sort of isn't required, right? So a way of being in the world can include, right, who you think God is, a relationship you believe you have with it, right? It can include all these things, right? Every belief that any form of Christian or Jewish person or Muslim would evince that say, this is a key part of our religion, is believing this, right? That is encompassed in that idea of a way of being in the world. But this also encompasses, right, your peasant farmer who doesn't care about theology, right, but who goes and participates in the festivals, goes and participates in the sacrifices, right, has the, what anybody would call the quote unquote religious elements of weddings, funerals, births, rites of initiation, right? All of these things, right?
Yeah.
Has that in a non-reflective or pre-reflective way, right? Because religion has to include that too.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why I use a way of being in the world, not a way of thinking or a worldview, but a way of being in the world, right? So the second piece is that it encompasses all levels of reality, right? And that sounds, I know, like a weird circumlocution, but if we start talking about the natural and the supernatural, or the spiritual and the material.
Yeah, that's one particular way of looking at that stuff.
Right. You're not going to include all, right, all religion in that.
Yeah, most of what we would consider religion throughout the history of the world does not think of the world that way.
Does not make those distinctions, right?
Yeah.
But the idea is that it encompasses all of reality as reality is conceived by those people. Right. So that it encompasses everything real. Right. And this is to get away from the idea that religion is just this element that covers this one part of life. Right. Because that's not really how religion has functioned historically.
Right. And most people who think of themselves as religious would not say, oh, well, that's just this little part of my life over here.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people like that for sure. There are. But most, yeah.
In the modern era, there are people like that.
Yes, right.
But that does cover most of world history. And then finally, we have the expresses itself in practices. Right. And that is that there is some kind of, not just things you do and things you don't do, but that those form a routine or a habit or a cycle or repeated practices, right? And we're using the term practices because this encompasses things like worship, right? But also encompasses things like ethical considerations.
Yeah.
And political considerations in the classical sense, right? Now, politics classically was just ethics at the level of community, right? So the way a person should govern their own life was seen as being of a piece with the way a ruler should govern a city, for example, right? Aristotle writes his ethics, then his politics, right? So we're using practices because it encompasses all that. It encompasses everything from fasting and dietary stuff to how and when you worship and who leads it and how you structure your family unit and how you, right? All of these things are encompassed by this idea of practices, right? And practices are kind of inescapable.
Yeah, like, I mean, and this again, not to pick too much on our Protestant friends, but there is this idea amongst a lot of Protestants, certainly the kind that I was when I was growing up, that had this idea that the practices you engage in, especially like, for instance, how you worship, is kind of optional, right? Like they would certainly say you should worship, but the particular way in which you do it, right? These specific practices of worship, that's kind of a matter of taste or preference, you know, so it's kind of switch outable, right? And one of the reasons that on the other side that you can kind of see this is go to the website of almost any Protestant church, and you will find a statement of faith if they're going to include something like this, right? A statement of faith. And the statement of faith is a list of beliefs. But rarely is there like a list of practices, because the beliefs are the core thing. And I remember even hearing a lot of people say, like, one major religious practice obviously is music. Say, well, it doesn't matter exactly what kind of music you use as long as the lyrics are expressing the beliefs correctly. So again, it's this idea that practices are sort of variable and optional and all that kind of stuff. But again, historically, that's not the case. And early Protestants, of course, would not have seen it that way either. Like this is a more of a modern Protestant kind of idea.
Yeah. And we want to be fair. And part of it is this thing that's been sort of bred into a lot of our Protestant friends, right? Like pretty much any Protestant I've ever known in a low stakes conversation, in a low stakes friendly conversation, if you say, should somebody who becomes a Christian get baptized? They're going to say yes. And if you say, should somebody who becomes a Christian attend Sunday worship? They're going to say yes. Should somebody who's going to be Christian, should they not participate in sexual immorality? No, they should not, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But if anyone says that, even with the word should a little too forcefully, right?
Works righteousness.
Right. There's this blanching. There's this pulling back of, well, no, none of those things are required for salvation. None of those things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There's just a sort of a should, right, but not must.
Right. But then if you wrap around and say, well, okay, so wait a minute. Let's pause, lower the stakes a second. Right. Are you saying, right, that if someone, comes and says they got saved on this date, but then they never go to church, they never get baptized, and they're a fornicator and a murderer, that they're gonna go to heaven because they got saved on that date, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And they're gonna say, well, no, right? They're gonna say they never really got saved then, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you say, well, then, so aren't you saying those things are required for salvation? They'll be like, no, they're not. Right? So that's what I mean by this ambivalence, right?
Yeah, it's. I mean, we're not going to solve this tonight, but it's the whole faith works thing. We've talked about this in detail before, but that's where that comes
just
from.
been sort of bred in. Yeah, and Exhibit A, they I don't know if folks know on YouTube, the good folks at Ancient Faith took a clip from our last episode and of some things I said to the effect of what I just said, and the comment section is kind of amazing. Right. In the knee-jerk reactions.
Huzzah.
And I say knee-jerk reaction because in some cases it's very clear that there was not any intent to try to figure out what I was actually saying. There was just a reaction, like a visceral reaction to, this sounds like a false gospel of works righteousness, right? Because beware, right? But again, it practices, right? Every Protestant I know goes to church at least most Sundays, and does it because they think they should. They go and get baptized. Whenever their church offers communion, they participate in it. they refrain from gross sin as best they can. When they do sin, they ask for forgiveness, right? Like, I don't know any Protestants who don't do that. I don't know any Protestants who are like, I'm going to do 0 good works between getting saved and dying, right? Just to prove that the one who does not work, it is reckoned as grace, right? I don't know anyone like that, right? I doubt you do either. If you do, get them help. So obviously Protestants aren't that way. And acting like Protestants are that way, like some Roman Catholic apologists do sometimes, is just ridiculous and childish, right? We get it. But, we need to be careful with the knee-jerk reaction, right? Because probably even when I said practices, well, you got to practice it. Yeah, you do, right? And we all know you do. And you can frame it as, well, that's part of sanctification, not justification. Whatever you need to do so that we can have the conversation. Okay, cool. But, right. But there's practices involved, right? There just are in religion, right? This definition is also nice because we don't have to worry about this whole distinction between what is a religion or what is religion and what is philosophy.
Yeah, especially because, this idea of the difference between religion and philosophy, like it's like, well, people think of the philosophy department, a bunch of guys sitting around thinking thoughts, writing books about those thoughts and teaching classes. But ancient philosophy, there were what we would regard as religious practices. Heck, ancient mathematics, there was religious practice that went along with it.
Oh yeah.
The mysticism of numbers. And on top of all that, the church fathers often refer to Christianity as the true philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. And even people who distinguish between philosophy and religion acknowledge that Pythagoreanism was a religion.
Yeah. Yeah.
For example. But Platonists at the academy, they had patterns of fasting. They spent periods of time in meditation, right? All of these things, right?
It wasn't Aristotle's school like in
a temple of Apollo. Yes.
There you go.
Right. So I know you've been told
available
by the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, all of the newfound atheists or worshipers of pure reason recast Socrates and Plato and Aristotle as like them in togas, right? It said, just like I have risen above the superstitious religion of my day, which is Christianity, they rose above the primitive religion of their day, which was Greek paganism. We've talked about this before on the show. That's absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Now, we're going to talk a little more about that in the second half. They thought they had a more refined version of religion, right? But they didn't think it was a separate religion. They didn't have a concept of a religion. But they didn't feel like they had absented themselves from the general civic and religious life of Athens, for example.
Yeah, they weren't dissented.
By doing that.
They weren't Quakers living in the midst of Anglicans.
Right. And last sort of note, within practices, another reason why the term practices, I think, is good, is that when we talk about practices within the same sort of religious milieu can admit of variation based on time and place, right? So a good example of that is dietary stuff, right? Almost all religious expressions have some kind of dietary stuff. It may be stuff you're not allowed to eat ever. It may be fasting patterns, right? But there's something connected to eating. And of course, that's going to be shaped a little in different parts of the world, right? Different kinds of terrain based on what's available.
Yep.
Right. And sacrifices are meals. So we're including sacrifices here. What animals you sacrifice, right? And what kind of grain offerings you offer are going to vary based on what the local grain is, and are going to vary based on, right, what the local wildlife, right, what the local domesticated animals are, right? And so the fact that there's a difference within that practice based on where you are does not necessarily mean, oh, now this is an entirely different religious expression, right? Because they're forbidden to eat pork and they're in a place where there are no pigs anyway, right? That's accidental. The fact that they're living in a place with no pigs is accidental. Or the fact that they're now offering rice cakes instead of wheat cakes is accidental, right? The fundamental religious expression, the fundamental religious practice is the same.
Yep. All right. Well, having run through all of that, which is much more memorable than the philosophy of science course I took back during the late Neolithic period, we're going to go ahead and take our first break, and we'll be right back with your calls on this episode of The Lord of Spirits.
Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung will be back in a moment to take your calls on the next part of The Lord of Spirits. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
The existence of fools for Christ in the Orthodox tradition mystifies many people, even some within the Orthodox Church itself. People often wonder what purpose these sometimes comical and oftentimes tragically misunderstood saints serve in the life of the Church, especially given their unconventional and seemingly bizarre behaviors. In Holy Fools by Oswin Creighton, we begin to gain a better understanding of these saints' curious manner of serving Christ as we learn about the extraordinary lives of 20 of the most well-known fools for Christ in a series of brief hagiographies. Available now at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back now with the Lord of Spirits, with Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung. If you have a question, call now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's the second half of the Lord of Spirits podcast, and this is episode 99, if you can believe it. Anybody know exactly how many hours we've been talking now? I feel like I've been talking to you for a long time. Yeah, so next time, what's that?
It's interminable.
Yeah, interminable, exactly.
It's probably related to, I was thinking during that commercial, right? Like, I've got the whole misunderstood comical fool part down. It's the saint part.
Oh, yeah.
That's the tricky bit.
I mean, it's easy to throw sausages at people and say hypocrite, hypocrite.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Who hasn't?
Right? I've been known to throw a sausage or two at some hypocrites. But yeah, so this is episode 99, and next episode will be episode 100, and we will also be celebrating our 4th anniversary.
That would be a nice round-numbered episode to just end the show with, wouldn't it?
Huh.
Just 100.
That's an idea. Could just sort of, cash in, take retirement. I don't know. I'm kind of done talking to you, so.
I'm not actually employed by Ancient Faith, so I get no retirement. So I'll have to.
I'll send you a fruit basket.
Not even a gold watch.
Not even a gold watch.
Straight to the, like, a fruit basket, or like an edible arrangement at least. Like,
ooh. I'll have to see what's available in your area.
Can we get the AFers to spring for that?
You do kind of live in the sticks.
I do not live in the sticks. I live in a swamp.
Oh, excuse me.
The sticks are all soggy and rotten. Right? Yeah. Like,
you do live in a soggy place.
Especially now, day after a hurricane.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, so next time, that's 2 weeks from today, is episode 100. It'll be our 4th anniversary. So I hope everybody will tune in. It'll be a very, very special next time on a very special episode of The Lord of Spirits. And I actually will be not here in the Tower of Podcasting in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, perched high atop the gateway to the underworld that is the building that I actually am currently in. This is a gateway to the underworld, down far beneath me, many floors beneath. I will be in the very belly of the beast, the very liver of Leviathan, Chesterton, Indiana.
Yes, the poor man's Ohio.
It's true. There's people saying on YouTube like, "Don't stop this show, fathers, never." I mean, at some point, guys, at least one of us is going to die, and it's probably going to be Father Stephen first.
So
you
I
had to
know,
put
probably
put your money down.
So, although only the good die young. So, I probably shouldn't tell you in advance, but
Very
the real
CD
reason,
song.
the real reason that next time is going to be a very special episode is that they're luring you to HQ for an intervention.
Oh, like Father Andrew, we know you like Father Stephen, but
No, I think it's more the Tolkien thing.
Oh. Yeah. I mean, it is true. It is true that I'm ending the Tolkien podcast. Maybe they're trying to make that go faster or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's when you started commissioning the icons that we all knew that you had a problem.
Yeah. I mean, should Balrogs have halos in addition to wings? I'm not sure yet, but
Should it be spelled Barlog? And should it look like Mike Tyson? These are the real questions.
wow. Oh man, that's a deep cut right there. Nice. So anyway, yeah. So next time is going to
You're
be episode
welcome.
100. Yeah, thank you. Episode 100 and our 4th anniversary. It's hard to believe. It is hard to believe we've been doing this since 2020.
Yeah.
A lot has happened since then.
We need to get people chanting 4 more years. That's what we need.
Come on, do it on YouTube, you guys. Start chanting 4 more years in the chats. They're not doing it.
Yeah.
I don't
The
know.
young Damic 24.
Disobedience. Yeah. Okay. Where were we?
Well, we're working our way back.
That's
Right?
true.
So we spent a lot of that time right in the early modern period
Yeah.
with a couple
Yeah.
dips back into ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Now we're going to go back even further,
Yeah.
all the way back to the year 2000. No.
Oh, someone on Facebook is saying 4 more years. So
Okay.
Facebook has outstripped the YouTubes this time. Take that, YouTubes.
Yeah. There's a very different ecosystem in the YouTube live chats.
Oh, it's true. Oh, yeah.
And I say this as someone who has spent hours mostly trolling in YouTube live chats. There's a whole different vibe.
There it is.
I don't know. I haven't seen a lot of quality trolling. When I go back and look at the live chat replay, right? Like sometimes I can look at the live chat replay. Sometimes I say
now
something.
they're saying 4 more years, and actually one person's saying 100 more years. Look, you're not.
I'm not living 100 more years. Sorry. You think I'm a vampire? Like
We're going to be lucky to get 20 more years. Frankly.
So the yeah, like sometimes I say something during the episode, and so you guys like take down the live stream and then re-upload it as a video, like to remove what I said. And so then I can't see the live chat. Like live chat replay disappears when you do that.
True.
Right.
It's true.
But the times when I can, the relatively few times where I can go and look at the live chat replay, I don't see a lot of quality trolling. And
People are going to
not
take this as a
looking at it.
challenge.
Right. I'm not looking at it during the show, but Father Andrew is. And Father
That's
Andrew is
true.
eminently trollable,
Thanks.
as I prove in every episode.
It's because I'm just so tenderhearted.
Yes.
I mean, anybody
More-
compared to you is tenderhearted.
Well, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Compared to me, week old steak is tender. But I sometimes experience emotions when inebriated.
No feelings.
No
What
feelings, just emotion.
No feelings.
And the emotion is usually rage, but just channel everything into that. But anyway, we're going back to the middle part of the first millennium BC.
Back in the day.
Yes, even further back in the day.
Pre-day.
Even further back than the year 2000. I like that now, you know, when I was a kid, the future was always the year 2000.
I know.
The future. And now we can say, like, way back in the long ago time, all the way back in the year 2000.
Where are the flying cars?
Yeah.
Where?
But no, we're not going quite to 2000 BC yet. We're going to go back further than that. But right now, we're around 500 BC,
Okay.
plus or minus 250 years.
Before Avery Brooks was born.
Yeah. So the middle part. And congratulations to everybody on surviving the Bell riots, since Father Andrew brought it up.
That's true.
So the middle part of the first millennium BC, which is referred to as the axial age. Axial.
Yeah.
Not the Axle Age, which would be either a Beverly Hills Cop reference or something about Guns N' Roses.
Exactly.
Yeah. But this is the Axial Age. That term came from was coined by a 20th century German, early 20th century German. And I know what you're thinking. Slow down. He was German Swiss. He was the more peaceful, neutral kind of German. Right? Early 20th century Germans. A lot of not so great stuff, but Swiss. He's Swiss. Okay.
Supplier.
So he was
bodyguards to the Pope.
Right. He was probably just, depositing the wealth of those evil Germans from Germany proper. In Swiss banks. I'm just slandering this anthropologist for no reason. Anyway, his name was Jaspers, by the way. Good German name.
I was like, what is happening? Anyway.
So he coins this term to describe this period for the center portion of the first millennium BC. And the reason he wants to coin a term to describe this age or this era is that there's this massive transition, massive shifting of religious forms literally all over the world at that time. And by all over the world, I mean from China to Greece to Egypt, right, to Judea, to, right, anywhere you want to pick, right? What are some of the things that are going on during this period? Well, if we're talking about Judaism, we get really the existence of Judaism proper, right? During this period, the Hebrew scriptures are being compiled, edited, right? In some cases, for some books, composed, right?
Yeah, this is post exile, like when they come back from Babylon.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
there
515 is the exile, right? That's the beginning of Second Temple Judaism. Yeah.
I mean, there are of course some people who claim, and I would just say to people, listen to some of the recent Whole Council of God episodes. Some people who claim that the whole Hebrew scriptures were written at this period, but there's all kinds of internal evidence that says that is not the case. But
that's why I talked about, in some cases, composition, in other cases, compilation and editing.
Yeah, because I mean, the Hebrew scriptures were written over a long period.
Yeah. But you also have, in addition to that, right, this transformation in what becomes Judaism over against, right, the religion of ancient Israel and Judah. Judaism, you see the rise of synagogues. You see the rise of the Pharisees as a class of scribes and textual scholars, because you have, right, the scriptures being composed, edited, compiled, right? And the forms, right, the forms that pre-existed that, the forms from ancient Israel and ancient Judah still exist. There's a second temple there. The temple's functioning. Sacrifices are being offered. The same feasts are being, all those things are still happening, right, from the Torah that were happening before the exile, right? In terms of religious phenomena. But you also now have this shift in these new religious phenomena related to the text of the Hebrew scriptures and related to the scholars of that text and the synagogue system as a means of gathering and religious observance, right? So that's a change. That's a shift.
Yeah.
Right? There's continuity, but there's also now this new layer, this new phenomenon that gets added. If you want to go over to Greece, right, at the very beginning of this period, you have Homer and Hesiod writing. And then once you get to the middle of this period, you've got the rise of philosophy and philosophical schools in Greece.
Yeah, and like you might think like Homer and Hesiod, like how is that a big change? Well, most indications are that a lot of what they're writing existed in some kind of oral form.
Right.
And now it's being written down, that kind of fixes it in a way that shifts. It's not quite the same.
Right.
Probably basically the same content, but now you're getting stuff written down. It's a literary function now.
And the reading and interpretation of, for example, Homer's text is going to become the basis of education for a couple thousand years.
Yeah, which that would
well
probably
into the
not
Christian
have been
period.
Yeah, right. I mean, and like that would be very different if it had remained purely an oral thing.
Right.
Very, very different.
Right. If you want to go over to China, right, Lao Tzu is in this period, the Tao Te Ching, the founders of almost every school of what's considered quote unquote Chinese philosophy, right, are all during this period. If you want to go to India, Buddhism emerges in this period. If you want to go to Persia, Zoroastrianism emerges in this period. Okay. So there is something happening, right, all over the world during this period. And that's why there was a need for anthropologists studying this period and studying ancient religion to say, we need a term for this era, this period of time when these shifts are happening worldwide, right? And when we look at those shifts, you may have already noticed as we were giving examples, there are some through lines, right? There are some similar particular phenomena that are going on in these different places. And so we could talk about some, especially within paganism, right? So Old Testament religion, right? Ancient Israel's religion and Judaism is a little bit of a special case, but we'll come back to that. Yes. Because there are some through lines there too. But everywhere else, we're talking about forms of paganism, right? And so there's some things we can see. So one of them is the depersonalization or the relativization of spirits and gods, right, within paganism. So, for example, Plato's forms, we've talked about this on the show before, Plato's forms are basically the Greek gods and goddesses stripped of all of the anthropomorphic personhood.
Yeah.
Right, which Plato, read the Euthyphro, right, believes is unworthy to ascribe to them. Right. Yeah. So instead of a god of justice who is a philanderer and right goes around doing these things, right, you have justice itself.
Yeah, and in you even get stuff that's kind of in between, like early you get this idea of muses, these very specific goddesses who inspire people to do particular artistic things. But then you also have this sense of like we might describe the spirit of music. But when someone says that, they don't mean a spirit exactly, but there's this, right. It's as you said, it's a depersonalization, but still with a sense of a spiritual reality.
And the personal elements get relativized, right?
Yeah.
So you still have Plato and Aristotle engaging in meditative practice.
Yeah.
Right. To connect with things that they think are divine, right? They've just sort of depersonified them, right? Made them less human in the sense of possessing human foibles, right? But you can also see this similarly, frankly, in the move of Buddhism out of Hinduism, the way, again, most forms of Buddhism treat the idea of gods and spirits from within Hinduism, right? Where it's not sort of like, well, we deny all those things exist any more than Plato did, but they become relativized, right? They become principles. They can become kind of depersonified. They become tools or elements of a ladder that might be useful to someone spiritually at a certain level of their development. But there are sort of more refined forms that go beyond that, right? So this is not, in either case, right, a rejection of the preceding pagan religion, but it is a participation from the perspective of those first participants and leaders is a participation in a more refined or purified or more noble or more worthy form of that religion.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
sometimes a kind of
That religious expression.
reinterpretation or additional layer of interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah. You also find a shift away from, so what you find in, for example, a lot of ancient Near Eastern religion and paganism is the idea that, the world is full of spirits and gods and over places, over things, and do things. And they're fundamentally capricious.
Yeah, they're just
Right.
dangerous beings that exist in your area, and you want to keep them from hurting you.
Right. And kind of fickle. They'll turn on you. They're easily offended. Right. Sometimes you just don't want them to know about you at all. Right. You can see this in Greek paganism too. I mean, this is kind of a through line in paganism. Right.
Yeah.
And so ritual and sacrifice and these things are often aimed at almost bribing or winning over, right? Gaining the allegiance of these spirits and spiritual forces and gods, right? And you see in these more refined forms that emerge in the axial age, a shift from that to an understanding that there is some kind of order or structure or harmony or path within the world itself.
Yeah, there's even, I mean, almost you could say there's a sense that there is the world,
Yeah.
that there's something more than just this.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what that means then is that if there is this kind of order, structure, harmony within the world, you can start having the concept of like ethics, right? Ethics and religion are so closely tied together in our minds, right? As modern people, because we've come from a Christian society, that we don't understand that there was not any real fundamental connection or even really a sense of ethics.
Yeah, this idea
all
of right and wrong.
Before the
I mean,
act-
really, it's much more like good and bad in the sense of like, this is a good chair and that is a bad chair.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking even before that,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
right? Even before that. I'm talking about before that starts to emerge in the axial age. Like before that, in large part, it's right. The king goes and, posts in a prominent place like the Code of Hammurabi, right? Here's the laws. And here's what I will do to you if you break them. Right? But if you're not in that city, there's not a law.
Right. You're just out there.
Right?
Who's going to make you?
Right? And the same thing with the gods, right? There are certain things that you wouldn't do because you thought, right? Like read some Greek tragedy, right? You do certain things and the Furies are going to come up out of Hades and get you, right? But it was fear of getting got, right? It wasn't, how do I need to behave and live in order to live a fulfilling and successful life, right? As part of a community that is thriving. Right. There was no concept of that. Right. There was no concept of that. Right. You were either in survival mode or you were enslaved or you were the one doing the enslaving. Right. But there was not this sense of like, there's a way I need to live in the world, and that our community needs to be governed so that it will thrive and grow and be successful. Right. And that included, right, when you get that idea coming about in the axial age of these various places, that included the divine. That wasn't to the exclusion of the gods. It wasn't like, oh, don't worry about the gods anymore. The gods were included in that, right? Like you needed to be in harmony with your family, your community, with the gods, right? With the divine, right? All of those things that's how you wanted to live your life so that all would go well with you. And even then, still sometimes bad things happen by chance.
Yeah.
Right. But there was still this idea, right, that there was a should, the way people should live. And, be careful, right? Because even as I'm saying that, I'm trying to choose my words carefully, because we as modern people want to individualize that.
Yeah, it's much more like what's good for the community as a whole.
Right.
How can the community flourish?
So at this point in the axial age, things are very communal, and the should is very dependent on your social class, for example.
Yeah.
So if you are a slave, then what you should do is work really hard at whatever you're ordered to do. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, it's understandable that the communal is is so privileged, because hanging together, it meant the difference between survival and extinction. Yeah.
So the kind of ethics we're talking about right now, though, is not, live your best life now, right?
No.
Like,
sorry,
they fully embraced in a way that we as modern people will not admit. They fully embraced, on the face of it, that for some people to prosper and have a very high standard of living, a whole lot more would have to not.
Right. Like, they just took that for granted, and they had no problem with the idea.
Yes. And everybody was in the social strata that they were because that's where they belonged. Right.
Yep. And even, and there were even detailed arguments that certain kinds of people were just sort of born to be slaves, or born to be masters, whatever.
Or born to be merchants, or born to be great generals, or born to be soldiers, right? Like, at all the different levels, right? And so there's a different there's a different ethic for each of them. And the aim of it is not really right? I mean, they accepted when they went to war that a lot of those infantry guys were going to die.
Yeah.
Right? And them going out there and dying bravely wasn't so great for them, right? or their individual families, but it was great for Athens. And that's what was important, right?
Yeah.
So don't individualize this too quickly, but it is still a watershed, having this idea of ethics, right? And having the idea of having that there's this harmony and order in the world that is reflected in that. And it's not just the caprice of gods and kings and larger people, right, with more physical strength, right, that govern the world. Right. And so we can see elements of this, though. We can see some elements of this, though, even in this transition from the religion of ancient Israel and Judah to Judaism, right? Especially Pharisaism. Pharisaism has a very strong sense of ethics, right? The Torah, when it was given, because I believe it was given well pre-exile, the Torah, when it was given, was talking about how to structure the society, how Israel should be structured, right? And what Israel should and should not allow within its limits, right? Because we have to understand that no one in Israel virtually could read in the pre-exilic period, right? The king was to, according to Deuteronomy, have a copy of the Torah and read it, because he needed to, because he needed it, because he needed to know what to allow and what not to allow, and how to structure and maintain order in the people of Israel, how to administer the temple, right, and its rituals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? The priests needed to know those things, right, in Leviticus, right? These people needed to know it, but your average ancient Israelite or ancient Judahite had pretty much no knowledge of what was in the Torah, contents of the Torah. There were not like Torah readings.
There was no Gideons
at the tabernacle. And if they
got copies,
if they had done a Torah reading at the tabernacle, only the priests would have heard it anyway, right? Because the people didn't all go to the tabernacle on Saturday to worship.
Yeah, nobody.
As we've talked about in the show, that's not how it worked.
Yeah.
Or the temple later, right? That didn't happen. Okay. And in the Northern Kingdom, of course, it's even worse because they're engaging in all kinds of pagan worship and stuff, right? There's not a Torah scroll to be found, right, for a normal person. Whereas, right, post-exile, once you have the synagogue system, you do start having public Torah readings. Right? Ezra does read the Torah publicly. Start having less writing and literary activity, right? So now your average Jewish person who's going to a synagogue is hearing the Torah. And so those commandments take on a new pertinence to them, right? So the Pharisees still believed that the solution to the problem, the ongoing problem of exile and Roman oppression, was that Israel, right, at that time Judea, had to corporately keep the Torah. Right? But the way someone participated in corporately keeping Torah was by keeping Torah themselves. Which Torah they now heard read at a synagogue. And so the Torah took on, in this period, an ethical dimension for Jewish people that it did not originally have. Right? A new dimension for them. Okay? So these shifts, even though we're talking about, right, different original religious structures, this shift does still take place. A parallel shift does still take place to produce what becomes early Judaism, ancient Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, right, in all of its diverse forms. So what causes this? Right? Why does this happen all over the world during this era in history? Right? Well, there's a number of factors that play into it, right? So first and foremost, you have sort of the stabilization of society during this period. So remember, we're coming off the Bronze Age collapse at the end of the second millennium BC. It kind of throws everything into chaos. And I know I've said before on this show, and I've said to lots of people, when you're envisioning the time period of David and Saul, and even into Solomon, right, at the beginning of the first millennium BC, you've got to picture it as sort of post-apocalyptic. The people are living in and around the ruins of the great Bronze Age civilizations. And there are people trying to take up those mantles, like the Assyrians will be trying to sort of, when they show up after a few centuries, will be trying to sort of take on the mantle of Babylon. Right. And then they're followed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, right, who are most certainly trying to lay claim to the empire of Hammurabi, right, to which they're not related, right, and trying to rebuild that, right, and reproduce that. The Philistines who you're running into are refugees from the Aegean who have come and settled in the Levant.
Are these the sea peoples?
Right. Or... Yes.
Yes, part of the sea.
They're one of the sea peoples, right? So there are a bunch of Greeks who washed up on shore, who are trying to structure some kind of society now in their new environs because they tried to take over Egypt and got repelled, right? Along with other sea peoples groups, right, in the area, right? So this is this kind of post-apocalyptic and rebuilding period. So once we get into the middle part of the first millennium BC, things have been rebuilt. Right, we've now got the Greek city-states functioning in Greece in the classical period, right, after sort of the collapse of the Mycenaeans. Right, Egypt has kind of recovered economically and financially. The Assyrians are on the rise, trying to rebuild Babylon. Right, so things have stabilized. Right, things have been rebuilt to a certain level. Right, and then you're going to get the Neo-Babylonians. Then you're going to get the Persians, right? And the Persians during this period are forming their religion, Zoroastrianism. All of this is being built, right? And taking shape. Their whole culture and sense of self is taking place during this axial age, right? All of this is happening. Similar things are happening in India and China in terms of rebuilding, and so things reach a certain level of stability, right? Because all of the other factors we're about to talk about that contributed to the axial age require you to have some kind of stability, right? Economically, in terms of the class structure of your society, right? If you're being invaded, if you're being attacked, if you're at war, if you're suffering from famine and plague, you know, you're not going to have time to learn to read.
Yeah, or there's not a lot of people going to be sitting around writing big, long literature. You know, It's like, look, pick up a spear, buddy.
Yeah. So that's why a lot of this starts happening, right? In this period, we get this stability. And then, as we've kind of already alluded to, you get an economic situation where you have the emergence of a very strong class system within these agrarian economies, right? Mostly based on slavery in various forms. But as we mentioned, they're very conscious about the fact that, yes, for these upper tiers of society to enjoy a certain lifestyle and certain things, to have leisure time, to be able to have time to devote to these other things, there has to be this great pool of people who are meeting their survival needs in terms of food, shelter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, tribute, taxes, right? All of this has to happen. And those structures come into place, right? Those structures come into place so that you can have a class of people, a literate class, right? And so the development of this literate class means there's this rise of literacy rates. This is also the period of time where people are now, at this time, using alphabetic language for the most part.
Yeah, as distinct from some of the kind of, you know, pictogram approaches.
Pictographic or consonantal vocabularies, cuneiform. This is important because this is a prerequisite for having a very high literacy rate, right? Is that you limit the number of characters that you have to learn, right? When you're looking at different forms of cuneiform, like simplified cuneiform alphabets have like 80 symbols. The simplified ones, right? You're not going to have a ton of literate people, right, in that sort of situation. Whereas an alphabetic language, right, where each symbol represents a sound, and there's, 20, 22, 24, 26 of them, right, much more workable, right, much more workable in terms of literacy. And so you get this rise of a literate class. That means people start taking oral tradition, stories, writing all these things that have been handed down orally and putting them into writing, and not only putting them into writing, but there are people who are able to read them, and they begin to be read publicly. And so you get the rise of public discourse.
Yeah, and then because of that, then you get rituals that are connected with this use of texts.
Right. So you start having, right, the Torah being read in the synagogues, right? Or you start having Homer being sung and performed publicly, right? And similarly in other cultures, right? It's not just a storyteller telling their version of the story that's localized and related to particular traditions, but they start to take on this larger form, right? And so you get a sort of enlarged religious significance of the text, right? So this shift, the reason we've been talking about this shift, there's someone out there who's like, wait a second, I thought this episode was going to be about the Stone Age. And I warned you at the beginning. We would not get there to the third half. They say, why are you dilly-dallying in the middle of the first millennium BC? Well, so this that we've been talking about, the Axial Age, there's this epochal shift we've been describing in religion across the world. And this one's really well documented because we've got all these texts from it, right? So we could describe it. We could research it. You can look at it. You can look at it in various countries spread out all over the world. You can compare and contrast, right? It's all documented. This is not the first major shift like this, though. There was a previous shift in the Neolithic era, in the Stone Age, right? That one is not documented because there was no writing. It's prehistoric, right? And so we've spent this time here in the second half talking about the axial age and this shift to give an idea of how this kind of thing works, right? Since this one is so well documented, to help us understand now, as we in the third half go back even way further, right? We're going to go further back from the axial age than the axial age is from us, to talk about what happened in the Neolithic revolution and what's going on there religiously.
Yeah. All right. We're going to go further back in time in the next half of Lord of Spirits, but now we're going to go ahead and take our second and final break. See you in a moment.
Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung will be back in a moment to take your calls on the next part of the Lord of Spirits. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
People often complain that the Divine Liturgy is always the same, week after week. But every ritual, phrase, and action in the service has meaning and purpose, drawing in worshipers with its hymns and prayers and allowing ordinary people to leave the world and enter heaven for a short time. In the new book, Blessed is the Kingdom, Father Stavros Akroterianakis, a longtime parish priest, offers reflections on the text of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom to help readers learn to pray the liturgy and to understand and appreciate the mystery that unfolds each time it is celebrated. Available now at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back now with the Lord of Spirits, with Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung. If you have a question, call now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Welcome back, everybody. It's the third and final half of this 99th episode of the Lord of Spirits podcast. Next time, it's going to be episode 100 and our 4th anniversary.
So, what happened to that ad for your new show?
It was too long, apparently.
Well, I know it was long. Oh, really? Like, literally?
No.
It told you? Oh, okay. So I was going to say, I kind of liked it. I could go get a cup of coffee, eat a sandwich.
No, that's true. It was a little long. Yeah.
Come back in time for the next half.
Look, we got to sell books, okay? I mean...
Did your co-host Rip Rogers get in trouble?
No. He's still on board.
You know what the weird thing about him is now that I've met him in person. Like, on when you hear him on Ancient Faith at a podcast or something, he kind of sounds like he's affecting a little bit of a light English accent. You think so? A little bit. But that level of affectation, that's commonplace for a Southerner, right? Like, yeah, we can deal with that. But here's what's weird when you meet him in person. He constantly speaks in this fake Jamaican patois. And I don't know, like, who he thinks he's fooling. Like, that's his natural voice. Like, I went to Peugeot Fest. He's sticking his head out of the sunroof of the car, yelling "Original Rude Boy" while we're driving around Tampa. I don't know what's with this guy.
I mean, look, the guy's name is Richard Rowland. He is literally a living Rick Roll.
If that is his real name.
So, yes. I mean, it might be his legal name.
I'm just saying.
I understand. You have things
odd.
It's
just odd. I'm not going to say it's racist, but it's weird. Okay.
Where were we?
The Stone Age.
Paleolithic, Mesolithic,
Neolithic,
Exolithic,
yes,
Hyperlithic.
Yeah. Although I also want to point out, some people may be wondering, as soon as you hear Stone Age, if you're of a certain age, you may think of the modern Stone Age family, the Flintstones. Right?
Which celebrated Christmas.
Yeah. Well, and here's why. You know why, right?
I've never really considered that question, actually.
There's this misnomer that the Flintstones are living in ancient times. Right? Like that this is some kind of, Ken Ham does the Honeymooners, where you've got, humans and dinosaurs living side by side.
I mean, it is true that their theme song says that they are a modern Stone Age family.
Right. The Flintstones is a post-apocalyptic show set in the far future. They're trying to recreate modern technology with primitive tools.
I'm on board with this.
And that's why they celebrate Christmas.
So Flintstones is actually farther in the future
than the Jetsons. Yes.
We can just go home now, everybody.
But we're now back in the past. So I mentioned the
I think we have our first New Zealander tuning in. Hello, New Zealand.
Oh, okay. I thought we had a call.
Wow. No. No calls.
This must
People
be completely clear.
So stunned at this revelation about the Flintstones. They're like, I don't even know what to do with myself.
Yeah. They may not even be. I mean, he got visited by an alien, the Great Gazoo.
Oh, yeah. And there's Freemasons.
And the Shmoo, like, come on. Okay. So, yes. So we mentioned the Neolithic Revolution, right? And this was not a class struggle in the Neolithic era. The Neolithic Revolution is not a political revolution. It was not televised, but not even written about. Because as we mentioned at the end of the second half, it was prehistoric. That's what prehistoric means.
Literally, yes.
Yeah. So there was no one writing about anything. So we know about it from the remains of human settlements and other archaeological remains and certain biological and genetic considerations, not with humans, but with plants and animals. We'll get into that in a minute. So the Neolithic Revolution happens across the Fertile Crescent, which is that sort of green arch on that map that they showed you in 7th grade social studies, that goes sort of over the top of the Middle East. It happened throughout that area between about 10,000 and 8,000 BC in different places at different times. I will give my usual disclaimer. If you don't think the Earth is that old, adjust accordingly. I find the whole question tedious and boring. So commonly dated to between 10,000 and 8,000 BC. And that's right after the end of the last ice age, right? And again, feel free to think whatever you want about the relationship between that ice age and the flood, that the evidence of that ice age is actually evidence of the flood, that the flood is describing the massive earth changes that happened at the end of that ice age. However you want to see it. You do you. Okay. But
wow, that's the most Zoomer thing I've ever heard you say. You do you.
Yeah. No cap. Anyway.
Wow. You've got such riz, Father Stephen.
Did you hear that sound, Father Andrew? Sound of billions of souls cringing and then falling silent. So during this period, the important thing, and what the Neolithic Revolution is describing, the revolutionary thing that happens, is that this is the period of time when humans begin to domesticate plants and animals. People don't think about domesticating plants much, right? But if you go to, and there are fossilized examples of this, right? And look at what wild wheat looked like before humans domesticated wheat. it's a very different thing.
Oh, yeah.
Much more difficult to process into something edible. Right. So yes, all of these plants that became agrarian staples for humans in human agrarian settlements existed before human agrarian settlements, right? But they existed as wild plants. And wild plants are often difficult to process into edible form. If not difficult, they're often inefficient to process into edible form. And so humans throughout history and prehistory, because all human beings throughout the history of the world have been just as smart as us.
Whoa.
I know.
How can that possibly be true?
I know. Have been just as smart as us. They figured out, without any knowledge of genetics, how to do selective breeding of plants and animals.
Mind-blowing.
Yes. They figured out how to do this, and it took a long time, right? The struggle of civilization. We should respect it. This is why I don't go camping. My ancestors fought for centuries so I wouldn't have to live that way. And this domestication of plants and animals is what's required for there to be a continuous human settlement, right? So before this, people are living in groups, extended family groups mostly, living by hunting and gathering, meaning people migrated nomadically following animals that were going to be used for food, because animals migrate, right? So as the animals migrated, the people migrated to hunt the animals, and then they gathered from wild plants, other foodstuffs, right?
Coconuts.
Huh?
Coconuts migrate.
Okay. So they're following them, right? If you're going to put down roots, if you say we're going to build a village, put up a village here, right? We're going to build our tents here. We're going to build more permanent structures here. We're going to stay here in this spot. Then you're going to need a way to generate food and feed the group of people who are going to be living in that spot, right? And since animals migrate away, that's going to be hard, right? Weather conditions change from season to season. That's going to be hard, right? You're going to eventually exhaust the supply of wild berries and plant life, right? That's edible, right? So all that's going to be difficult. So the only solution to that problem is we need to start domesticating plants and growing the food we need deliberately in a way that we can grow it season after season, year after year. And we're going to need to domesticate some of these animals. Now, by domesticating animals in this period of history, I'm not talking about like domesticating horses to ride them, right?
Yeah, this is about food.
That's thousands of years after that, right? This is, we're going to selectively breed sheep and goats, right? So that they're a little less ornery, right? And we could get them into a pasture, right? We could get them into an enclosure, right? We could shepherd them. We could take them around and let them graze, right? And raise them for food, right? Etc. That kind of domestication, whether it's sheep, pigs, goats, right? Livestock. That's what we're talking about domesticating at this point in history as a food source. So rather than going and finding them, we're going to bring them here, keep them penned up, breed them, and eat them rather than hunting them. So that's what's required, right? So we also need to keep in mind that the world population at this point is very low. People debate, like everything else, how low, right? But everyone agrees, again, regardless of what you think the relationship between the evidence for the Ice Age and the flood is, right? What your completely secular, right, anthropologist will tell you is that, depending on their estimate, during the Ice Age, at one point, right, during this period when the Ice Age evidence exists, the human population of the world, they will say, fell to somewhere between 10,000 and 600. 600 is the low estimate, 10,000 is the high estimate. That's not the human population of an area. That's the human population of the Earth.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, my town is 11,500 people.
Right. So that's not quite giving you 7, right? If you're very literal, right, about Noah's flood and only the 7 people on the ark surviving it. But it's an acknowledgement that something happens, right, during that period that greatly diminishes the human population to this
lot fewer people,
to this tiny amount, right, on the whole Earth, right? By the time we get to the period of the Neolithic Revolution that we're talking about, right, you still have this wide variation. The sort of the low estimate is 55,000 people. The high estimates are between 1 and 5 million. But if we take 5 million as the highest, again, that's 5 million in the whole Earth.
Yeah.
Right? 5 million people is probably, I bet you there's 5 million people in the state of New York.
I mean, there's 5 million people. There's more than 5 million people in the city of New York.
In the city of New York. Okay.
There's
so
8 point. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a West Coast guy. I don't
8.3 million. Currently.
We spread out a little more. We don't pile
New
up.
York.
So this is, if you think that on the high estimate, the entire population of the Earth was lower still at this point than the population of the city of New York. Right. This is a very different time. By the time you get to 1000 BC, so the time we were talking about after the Bronze Age collapse and everything, the time of Kings David and Saul, right, in terms of biblical chronology, 1000 BC, there were about 14 million people in the whole world, which I think is roughly the population of, say, Greece today.
So you're just throwing this stuff out and making me look it up.
I think Greece has 11 or 12 million people.
Greece is about 10.5 million.
10.5. Okay, so it's a little bigger than Greece. Maybe Germany.
Oh, man. Now, Germany is 84 million, Father.
Oh, well, for Pete's sake. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, for crying out loud.
We're not going to keep guessing. Okay,
It's
we're not
a
going to keep guessing.
superpower by comparison.
Okay, a small European country. What's the population of a small European country that will remain nameless?
5 Lithuanias.
Yes.
There we go. Yeah.
That's the whole population of the Earth in 1000.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think we realize, right, how small it got. But especially at this point, we're talking about the Neolithic Revolution, right? We're talking about, again, even on the highest estimate, way fewer people than live in the city of New York in the world.
Yeah.
Right. On Earth. So these settlements, right? These are not even like Sumerian city-states. Right. I know they made that movie 10,000 BC, which I enjoy for its ridiculousness, where they have like the mammoths. They're using the mammoths to build pyramids.
Oh yeah.
Ziggurats and stuff. That's crazy. But anyway, it's crazy. So get that out of your head. There are no, right. We're talking about settlements, right? We're talking about one of these extended family units that had been wandering from place to place, following game, putting down roots and establishing a place. Okay. And when this happens, right? There is a corresponding shift in religion that is detectable in the archaeological record. Okay, there is a shift that happens. And we've talked about some of this in previous episodes, a little bit at least, from another angle.
By the way, I just want to interrupt you, Father, because we actually do have some people who are calling.
Oh, good.
So since we're here in the third half, we might as well go ahead and take some of them. So yeah, we've got someone who wants to fact check something you said earlier, Father. About
the Flintstones?
Yeah, we have Caleb, who's, he pulled out his copy of Deuteronomy. He's like, now hold on a minute. So Caleb, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Greetings, Pod Fathers. Greeting, Father Stephen and Father Andrew. I had to put your billing around so I didn't mess up your names.
Yeah.
Anyway,
you ready to fact check Father Stephen DeYoung?
Well, I hate to put it that way. I never would. At any rate, I would.
Well, clearly you're a liberal, because fact checking is liberal. But go ahead.
Yeah. So, as far as the whole population question, that was hilarious. I will say, it's getting harder to be someone, but it all works out.
Mm-hmm.
The question I had, speaking of which, that also reminds me, Father Stephen, we had one of your chanters visit at our parish up here in the UP of Michigan a little while ago, and really appreciated him. So,
well, it's good someone appreciates him. That's
all right. My question is Deuteronomy 31. There's a commandment there. Moses commands that the Torah should be read in the hearing of all the people once every 7 years.
Yes.
And I didn't hear your whole spiel earlier. I'm actually on break at work, but I was wondering how that fits into. Obviously it wasn't followed most of the time, but there must have been times where it was followed.
Yeah, it pretty much wasn't followed, at least during the. It looks like it wasn't followed much at all. I would assume Joshua did it, and we have record of Joshua doing it once. In the book of Joshua. In the book of Joshua, he does it at one point.
Okay.
But in the period of the judges, it wasn't done. And we know when King Josiah rediscovers it in the temple.
Yeah,
it's all new to him even.
Right. Exactly.
Whoa, this stuff. Yeah. So, okay. So it was basically like the first generation after Moses, and then it just disappeared until, say, the time.
Right. It fell into disuse. Right. And you see the same thing happening. I mean, in general, right. The story of the book of Judges is about the people sort of forgetting everything, and the tabernacle falls into disuse. They start creating other shrines and altars and things. There's just sort of this immediate falling away. And then there's sort of and Judges, of course, ascribes that to, Israel needs a king, right? To sort of set this straight, and then sort of helps position, moving through the Deuteronomistic history into 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st and 2nd Kingdoms, that David is the guy, right? But then things fall apart pretty quickly again after David.
Okay.
Where even we also know from the Josiah story that Solomon puts an idol of the sun god's chariot in the temple courts.
Yikes! Yeah.
Yeah.
Would it be safe to assume that this was possibly obeyed during the reign of David or reigns of David and Solomon, perhaps?
Solomon would probably be pushing it. Maybe David.
Okay.
But for the most part, it wasn't being followed.
All right.
And they also, we know from Jeremiah, never kept the Sabbath year either, which if it was done every seventh year, that's when it would have been done.
Oh yeah, huh? That makes sense. It's tied into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that'd be a good way of actually seeing, or how would you say, extrapolating whether it was actually being done or not.
Yeah, because God tells Jeremiah, you basically, you're going to be in exile for 70 years because you owe me 70 Sabbath years that you didn't keep over the last 490 years.
Right. Yeah. So preach that one to American agriculture.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Thank you very much, fathers. I need to get back into work, but
all right.
Have a excuse to call you.
Thanks for calling, Caleb.
Yep.
All right. we have another caller, actually. So since we're paused, we're going to go ahead and take Catherine. So Catherine, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Hi, Fathers. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm excellent. I do have, it's maybe an adjacent question, but it's a serious question. And I was wondering, in the description of this podcast, I saw the word Neolithic.
Yeah.
And that just fired off a couple things in my mind. And I was wondering if you could answer them. Since Neolithic, the etymology of it, if I'm not mistaken, means new stone, right?
Yeah, that's sort of like there's like three parts of the Stone Age: Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic, and that's the latest part is the Neolithic period.
Okay, because what I was thinking is if there's a new, there has to be an old, and so I'm wondering
that's the Paleolithic.
Okay, so in regards to that, is that pre-flood or pre-Babel, or were people writing things down? I'm just wondering, where does that start? Where like what is the difference? Did they have the Neolithic period after the flood or after Babel, or before? In regards, just to writing in general.
What do you think, Father? I mean, there's so many different ways you could shake this question out, I guess. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So it partially depends on what you think is the relationship, as I mentioned very briefly, between the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, and the flood. So there are some people who would say that all of the archaeological and geological evidence of the last Ice Age is really evidence of the flood. So they would say that basically the last Ice Age is the flood, right? They would identify those two things. There are other folks who would say that the story of the flood is telling, right, that sort of when that happens is at the end of the last Ice Age. So at the end of the last Ice Age, according to archaeology and geology, there were these massive earth changes, meaning the Ice Age is called the Ice Age because glaciers expanded over, like, for example, most of North America was covered by ice or water in some form, right? There's evidence during this period, right? So that's why, so the people who say, well, that is the flood would say, well, that was liquid water. It was the flood, right? But other people would say, well, no, that was glacier. But then at the end of that Ice Age, those glaciers melted. And when those glaciers melted, they released the trapped water. So, for example, there's archaeological evidence of a couple of cities at the bottom of the Black Sea. So there's pretty good evidence now that during the Ice Age, there was no water in the Black Sea. And that there were people living there. And at the end of the Ice Age, right, as the glaciers melted, it filled up with water and became the Black Sea, right? So some people would say, well, no, the flood happens at the end of the last Ice Age when the glaciers melt, right? And it wipes out all of these, human civilization as it had stood, right? Using the Black Sea as an example. There are plenty of other examples beside the Black Sea, right?
May I make a point?
Sure.
I've worked in northern Alberta and a lot of the in Canada, and a lot of the geological formation is water that was above forests. So if it froze, it was forests there, and then it was water.
Yeah.
So for me, I don't see it as flood post Ice Age.
Right. Well,
in my regard.
Yeah. However you want to look at it. But so the idea is the Neolithic period is the period right after the Ice Age. So if you connect the Ice Age to the flood, It would be the period after the flood. And so we would be talking about when we talk about the Neolithic revolution, we would be talking about, if that's your understanding, we'd be talking about the period of time where the population grows to the level that we've been talking about. And so starts to build cities and towns and, villages at this point. Starts to build villages, right, and settle down in permanent places and begins more intentional agriculture.
Okay, so it's after the flood, but before Babel?
I would say yes. Yeah. Because I think the Tower of Babel is actually related to the Bronze Age collapse. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for calling, Catherine. Okie doke. So, yes, world population, very small.
Very small.
Very small.
So, so there's this transition in religion that happens as there's this transition to settled life, right? And to kind of understand that, we have to start with a little bit of an idea of what does hunter-gatherer religion look like, right? And we've talked about this. We've read a couple of quotes. You can go back to old episodes, very early episodes. And here's some of the quotes about early quote-unquote monotheism. We've already reiterated this episode why quote-unquote monotheism may not be the most helpful category to have in our head. But just the idea that early on in the hunter-gatherer period, there is pretty good evidence, right, that we're dealing with primarily one sort of deity or spirit that people understand to be associated in some way with the sky, with the heavens, right, above them.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the early, even a lot of the early Indo-European stuff is the main god is, as you said, in some way kind of like a sky god or a heavenly god or something like that.
Right. And there's sort of one, and then what happens once we start moving to settled life is that the earth suddenly becomes very important, because now we're going to live by planting and growing crops. So the idea of some
kind of deity in the earth or related to the earth, you want that spirit's attention and help.
Right. The ground, the soil, the fertility of the soil, right, becomes eminently important. And you start also getting, and the Neolithic period is when we get these first cultic figures of an earth goddess, right? And so there comes to be this pairing in this early phase, right, and coming out of the Neolithic period, of a sort of masculine sky god and a feminine earth goddess, right? But it's that earth goddess that gets added. So it's here where we start moving in, they take that first step toward a multiplicity of gods, right? Takes place within the Neolithic revolution and the move to settlements. And then once you have settled life, right? Once you have settled life, this can then give rise to all kinds of spirits and cultic deities, meaning spirits and lesser sort of quote unquote deities that you can invoke, get to do favors, bribe with different things, right? That will cover different aspects of settled life. Once you start having villages and then eventually towns and eventually cities, you start to get this multitude of gods and spirits, even in an individual place.
Yeah, because if that particular place becomes important to you now because you live there, which in nomadic societies you don't, if you live there and you have the sense of, okay, this deity is associated with this place, then you start to form these kinds of relationships.
Right. And we see that with the development of sacred sites, right? Many of the first of which are fountains, springs of water, because obviously you need water to live. Hunter-gatherers do too. But when people go to settle, they start to settle at the sacred sites, right? They don't settle in a place for some kind of materialistic reasons and then sort of spiritualize some elements of that place.
Yeah, and
Right.
and I mean, like, one of the ways that we know that this is the case is that there are these settlements in places that make no sense in terms of like natural resources or whatever.
Right.
You know,
Right. And we're going to start talking about particular settlements, the most ancient settlements we've found and that we know of. And what you find in those settlements is that the ritual elements, like megalithic stone structures that clearly have a religious purpose, right? Those are there before the homes, the residences, the dwellings are, right? And before the agricultural projects start, right? So these sites are sites that are found and encountered by nomadic peoples. And then when the time comes for the nomadic peoples to settle down, they settle down at these sites. So they find a spring of water. There's a spirit that they associate with that spring of water, right? They form a settlement there. The spirit they had associated with the spring of water now becomes one of the gods of that people, right? They start to worship it, right? And we talked about this in terms of what happens after Babel and the fact that there are angelic spirits, right, associated with these different things, right? But the problem is humans are now starting to worship them as gods, right, in and of themselves. So going to the earliest settlements we have, right? So one of the earliest sites we have that's become semi-famous, though sometimes weird things are said about it, is Göbekli Tepe.
yeah, which we've mentioned on the show a few times before.
Yeah. I think it was way back in the long ago time, though. But like the year 2000.
Why?
Göbekli Tepe seems to have first been settled around 9130 BC. Again, if you think the Earth's not that old, adjust accordingly, right? But that's the traditional standard sort of dating. It's near the Syrian border with Turkey. And the main feature there, the thing that gets everybody excited, are these massive megaliths. Right? There are these huge megalithic stones with animal forms carved into them. And they are arranged. It is an even more ancient Stonehenge, but with these elaborate carvings that Stonehenge lacks.
Yeah,
Right?
which
The Stonehenge stones are just propped up. I know firsthand, are just propped up. Right.
Yeah, people, if you want to see what the stones at Göbekli Tepe look like, you could just Google it up and have a look at what they look like.
Right. And they are arranged in a way somewhat similar to what's going on with Stonehenge, in that most people agree now that they were used for astrological observation. Right. That the stones were put in place for the purpose of, and in some way the ritual carvings are connected to constellations and things that would be at certain points during certain times of the year. Getting into super detail, there are people trying to get into super detail on that, in the sense of exactly where what constellations were, like in 9130 BC and stuff, and in that period. But that is actually really hard to do, especially going back that far, because the Earth kind of wobbles in its orbit. So things shift slightly. The stars are not in the same place they were 5,000 years ago, right? Let alone 10, relative to any given position on Earth. But it's a general agreement that that's there. But again, those megalithic structures were there before anything else that has been found there, which suggests that these were built as this spiritual site, right? As this site of religious ritual and sacrifice, to which nomadic peoples would come at a certain time of year. And then at a certain point, a certain later point after these megalithic structures were built, then we find other like domestic housing units, right? For lack of a better term, domiciles. We find evidence of human settlement there a little later, right? So then at a certain point, people start to settle there at the spiritual site permanently, rather than just migrate there at certain times of year for ritual purposes, religious purposes. And this is true of all of these earliest sites that we found that we're going to talk about now. The ritual site in every case is there first and exists as a place that people make what we would call a pilgrimage to. And then only later, right, do people settle around it on a permanent basis. Right. And this is something that not only happened during the Neolithic Revolution, this has happened throughout human history with sacred sites. Right, where towns, villages, and things will grow up around certain sacred sites. There are two more very early sites. One of them is Jericho, like the city of Jericho that's in Joshua. The city of Jericho, there has been a human settlement there since circa 10,000 BC. Again, adjust accordingly, but that's a big circa, because rather infamously, the site of Jericho was kind of ruined by bad archaeology.
Dang it, bad archaeology.
There was a certain period of European archaeology where they got access to especially sites of the Holy Land that had some biblical significance. And there was a rush by dabblers with some money, especially among the British, to get down there and say, now we can prove that the Bible is true. And being non-gifted amateurs, they wrecked a few sites, and Jericho is infamously one of them. They just started digging trenches and stuff in ancient Jericho. And so that's made it really hard. Just about anything you see about Jericho, right, is super provisional. And for the record, if you see anyone saying anything definitive about the archaeological site of Jericho on either side, right, if you see someone saying definitively, there's no way that Jericho was destroyed in the time of Joshua, whenever they think that was, be leery, because the site's a mess. You can't prove that. But also if they say, oh no, for sure, the city of Jericho was destroyed in the time of Joshua, whatever they think that was, they're also playing fast and loose, right? The site's kind of a mess. So we can't learn as much from that as we might from some of these others that remain undiscovered. But the other one we're going to talk about a little more is Çatalhöyük, which is from circa, again, 7100 BC. Again, adjust accordingly. So this one is a little further on, by a little I mean a couple thousand years, than Göbekli Tepe, but is a more advanced site, right? And it's a sort of fully developed site. Now, when I say fully developed, again, we're not talking about even a Sumerian city, but there are clear individual family residences there.
Yeah.
Where you can lay out the floor plan, like we understand where people lived. The religious site is more developed. So progress has been made in terms of human settlement by this point. But it also gives us a window into sort of a couple other aspects of religion, right, in the Neolithic revolution. One of those is that we have burial sites. So at Çatalhöyük, in the individual family residences, the burial sites are in the floor, right? So there's a dirt floor, and the departed family members were buried in the floor, right? In the family's domicile. And they were buried with some things, right? They were buried with things like food and extra clothing.
Yeah, which suggests, hey, you're going to need this in the afterlife that we clearly have some concept of.
Right. So they had some concept of some kind of afterlife, because otherwise why wouldn't they keep those things? Because they would need them, not the dead person.
Yeah, valuable stuff.
And there were also animal remains, and not of pet animals, of sacrificial animals. Which implies that there were sacrifices being offered in conjunction with the burial. Right? Which again further suggests the idea of an afterlife and the involvement of spirits, because again, why would you offer a sacrifice for a dead person if they're dead and gone, right? The other major element is that there are individual shrines inside these family homes. And these individual shrines take the form of bullheads and sets of bullhorns. Not bullhorn like you yell through while you're picketing outside Walgreens. Like the horns of a bull, like you put on the front of your car if you live in Dallas.
Yeah, I'm told they all have that in Dallas.
Yes. Because of the Longhorns, they're fans. Unless they're Aggies.
Didn't Boss Hogg have that in the Dukes of Hazzard?
I think so. I think J.R. Ewing did too.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're actually illegal in most of Texas, but they're not so good if you're in a car accident. But so there are these bull representations in the shrines within the home, right? And we know there's shrines because there's evidence of burning incense and sacrificial offerings, which implies, right, there's family worship going on, and that is connected to a bull figure, right? And by the time we get writing, as soon as we get writing, which is sometime after this, but you immediately see bulls everywhere, right? Particularly in terms of your sky or your storm god. The sky god becomes a storm god when rain becomes important for growing crops, right? And you can see Hesiod records this transition. He has the memory of this transition because he's got that extra layer of Gaia and Uranos, right? The heavens and the earth, right? As being sort of that first phase of divinity. And then you get Kronos and the Titans. Then you get Zeus, the storm god. And that's, he's kind of encapsulating some religious history there in his version of the succession myth, the double succession there. So we immediately find, the bull of heaven in the Epic of Gilgamesh, bull Baal, right? All of this, right, bull symbolism gets carried on. So we know it goes back to this period. And then there's also sort of that is the masculine. Then you find, for example, Göbekli Tepe, some of the animal forms are fish and sea creatures. You find the sort of sea serpent. So we've talked about behemoth and leviathan, right? Behemoth and Lotan, right? The sort of toxic masculinity and toxic femininity of ancient paganism. But at this very early tier of pagan religion, right? Leviathan or Lotan is sort of this symbol of order and power and strength and virility, and Lotan or Leviathan, the sea serpent, chaos, right? Destruction, disorder. And we see this reflected even in these sort of earliest sites. And so through this process of people settling in places, we get the beginnings of paganism as we would talk about paganism today.
Yeah, people
Right.
worshiping gods.
Yeah. The kind of paganism that was practiced everywhere from India to Egypt to Greece, right? That kind of paganism that got refined in the axial age that we were talking about.
Yeah.
But that step emerges out of the Neolithic Revolution and people beginning to settle. Right. And if you compare, right, this is a question we get a lot because we talk about how that kind of paganism is kind of ubiquitous in the world.
Yeah. And so some people say, well, hold on, wait a minute.
Yeah.
What about like Native Americans with their sort of semi-monotheistic belief in a great spirit?
Right. Associated with the sky.
Yeah. And I mean,
Right.
some people will say, well, does that mean that these people were worshiping Yahweh and never fell into paganism?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Or certain Pacific Islanders, right, other indigenous islanders similarly, right? Couple things. Just looking at, say, North and Central America, right? We could probably throw in South America, right? When you look at the cultures that had made the Neolithic Revolution, right, who had built cities, right, and had stoneworking technology, right? That's why it's called the Stone Age, because people were using stone tools, as opposed to the Bronze Age, right, or the Iron Age. When you look at them, they all fell into, you look at the Incas, you look at the Mayans, you look at the Aztecs, they basically fell into the same kind of patterns of paganism as everybody else, right? The groups that maintained more of the earlier view are the ones that remained closer to the hunter-gatherer way of life.
Yeah.
Right? So that particular shift didn't happen for them. But even though, right, we're not going to say that, right, the sky spirit that somebody's talking about is identical to Yahweh, the God of Israel, right? That is closer, right? So that kind of religion is closer to the religion of, say, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right, than paganism is, right? They're a lot closer than the Aztecs, right? And so this movement that happens, right, from the religious movement, from the religion of hunter-gatherers to the religion of the settled, to paganism, represents a sort of religious falling away, right? It is a negative religious development from the perspective of the true God, right? Into the worship of many creatures, essentially, right? As opposed to most beneficently, what we can call those other holdovers is sort of a half-forgotten memory of the true God, right?
Yeah.
But there's still this memory of this Most High God out there. And there are reports from from Christian missionaries who went to some of those groups of exactly that, right? They kind of approached it the way St. Paul did the unknown God, right? Like, that kind of Most High God, that Father God, who you have this idea was out there somewhere.
Yeah.
Let me tell you about him. Right?
And also it should be noted that it's not easy to figure out exactly what some of these groups practiced and believed prior to their contact with
right.
European Christians, because frankly, there's often not literacy, and
they were mostly
dead
dead from disease.
Mostly dead. And there's some indications that there's a transformation that occurred with the contact with Christianity. And so there's not any kind of, in many cases, a truly pre-Christian image of what they were doing.
Right. So what was the point of this episode? I don't know. I had to think of something to talk about.
Yeah, what's the point, Uncle Steve?
Why, Father Stephen? Why?
I know. It's almost 3 hours of my life once again.
Yes, that you'll never get back. No. So the point is this, right? The point is this. We need to, this may end up being my final thoughts again. I may be fiddling with our whole schema here.
Okay, we're getting close to episode 100, ready to flip everything upside down.
Pack it all in. Yeah. This will probably end up being my final thoughts too. But so what's the point? Well, so the point is, in our understanding of religion, right? Our understanding of religion, we need to be a little more nuanced than we typically have been. Because humanity was around for a long time before even the Torah was written. And we know from the Torah that God was active during that time. And God was active throughout, right, the period when the Torah, as we talked about with the caller, was supposed to be read but wasn't being read. And God was active throughout the Second Temple period. God was active, and of course he has been active through all of subsequent Christian history, right? But we tend to have this kind of weird idea that, like, before God talked to Moses, like, he'd been forgotten about, right? Or we've so cast our idea of religion in general around our particular variety of Christianity, whatever that might be, whether it's Orthodox Christianity or something else, that we're like, well, I mean, how would a hunter-gatherer have gotten saved, right? Hunter-gatherer didn't have sacraments. Like,
just the question itself is kind of amazing.
Yeah, like hunter-gatherer didn't have sacraments, right? Like generations of people, right? All over the world. That's right. What we're talking about when we say Orthodox Christianity, right? You want me to define Orthodox Christianity? Orthodox Christianity is the right worship of the true God. And what that means in a certain sense is that anywhere in the history of the world and of humanity where the right worship of the true God has taken place, we could say that was Orthodox Christianity. When we, on the Sunday of the Triumph of Orthodoxy, I'd like to say we're not being triumphalistic, but it's called the Sunday of the Triumph of Orthodoxy, so we got to own it. When we say we read the creed together the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, and we say this is the faith on which the world was founded. Right? We're not making the claim that 19th century German Lutherans made. We're not saying, finally, through the long scrabble of human history, we have arrived at Orthodox Christianity of the type practiced in my parish in southern Louisiana in the 21st century, which is the pinnacle of all human religion, and all those benighted fools in the past didn't know what they were talking about and didn't know who God was. Right? We're making almost the exact opposite claim. Right? We're claiming that what we're doing in the right worship of God and what St. Nicephorus, the confessor of Constantinople, was doing in the early 9th century, and what St. Paul was doing in Corinth when he lived there, what he was leading, and what Ezra was doing after the exile, and what David was doing, and what Moses and Aaron were doing, and what Abraham was doing, and what those people in the genealogies of Abraham and Seth were doing, and what all the people whose names we will never know in all those generations past in prehistory were doing when they rightly worship the true God is all the same thing. It's all the same thing. Right? There are things that we know about God now that they wouldn't have been able to articulate then because God hadn't revealed them yet. Right? So, yes, nobody was saying the Nicene Creed at Çatalhöyük in 6850 BC. Okay. But if there was anyone there, and probably not at Çatalhöyük because it was a pagan site, but if there was anyone who passed through there who, like Melchizedek or Jethro, right, had maintained the correct worship of the true God, right, then the God who that person came to know through sacrifice and prayer is the same God that we come to know through the liturgy, through the sacraments, through the scriptures. It's the same God. Right? That God is the same three persons then as now. And so it is fundamentally the same religion. Right? Not the pagans, but those who truly worship the true God throughout all the ages. It's all the same religion. And there are these transitions as texts are written and texts are recognized and texts take a place. The reading of text takes a place in worship, right? But that doesn't mean it's a different God. And the fundamentals of worship, of sacrifice and of prayer and of the offering of incense haven't changed. Right? It's the same God being truly worshipped by humans who are the same kind of humans. Right? Just over time, as our human way of life has shifted, there have been shifts to it. As we've migrated, as we've multiplied, as we've gone different places and had different experiences. Right? It's taken on different shapes. But if it's the right worship of the true God, then it's the same. And, as we've always posited on this show, and I'm not embarrassed of, I believe that one religion is Orthodox Christianity. Because that's the God who it is. Right? That's the God who it is, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So that's both my why this episode and my final thoughts as I mess with the episode structure.
Yeah, I think, just to extend a little bit what you just said, I think especially here in 2024, where a lot of us are trying to muddle our way around in a societal level meaning crisis, one of the big temptations is to super left brain it all, give me the precise, exact formulaic approach to X, Y, and Z so I can get this right. And ironically, even though we tend to think of this kind of thinking as sort of scientific, ironically, it's actually very magical kind of thinking. And if you look at what the scriptures say about what it means to worship the one true God, there are ultimately consistent, if you understand it correctly, but varying approaches to that over time. For instance, everything you see in Leviticus does not all carry forward into the new covenant, right? So there's clearly something different going on, but it is, as you just said, Father, it is consistent. It is the same religion, even though the practices have a transformation. And with this kind of absolutizing of formulae that gives a lot of us a sense of, I think it feels safe, well, the world is nutty, and so, give me the straight dope here so I can get this exactly right, because I want to get it right, because I'm tired of all the wrong. What you do is you end up absolutizing stuff that in some cases is not supposed to be absolutized, or was appropriate for a particular time and place and may not necessarily be appropriate for now. For instance, God does not command us to offer up goats on altars now, right? I don't think anyone seriously is doing that now, but I'm sure somebody is actually, probably. But most people are not saying that's what we should do. But nonetheless, there can be this kind of, again, a formulaic approach to religion. And we absolutize things that can be variable, and we often variabilize things or vary things that should actually be absolute. And the point is to know and to worship the one true God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and not to worship these other gods. That's the point. And even though the exact shape that takes over time can alter, the point is to orient ourselves towards Him, right? And this absolutizing impulse is frankly an impulse towards idolatry. And it's an idolatry of our concepts about God. Now, by saying that, I am by no means nullifying the dogmatic inheritance of the church or anything like that. But sometimes people take the dogmas that speak about who God is and they worship them instead of God Himself. Right? That's what I mean. And one of the ways that we can see we're falling into that, or at least having a temptation towards that, is if we spend more time, frankly, and more energy on our concepts about God than we do on the actual practices of worshiping Him and praying to Him. Because a lot of people have been saved. A lot of people have been saved who were faithful to God, but had very, maybe even incorrect or primitive concepts about Him. A lot of people have been saved that way because they were faithful and did the things that they were supposed to be doing. But a lot of people, frankly, are going to have some answering to give in the life of the age to come, who spend a lot of time absolutizing particular pictures of God and not actually following his commandments, right? And so, one of our big themes for this podcast for the last 4 years now, and hundreds of hours now, has been, if you love God, you will keep his commandments, as it says many, many times in the scriptures. And I think that looking at this kind of massive arc of human history and seeing how there is this variance over time, there is these changes over time, underlines this, right? Because the whole point is to approach the one true God and to worship him. That's the whole point. To have that fundamental orientation and to follow through and to do the things that you're supposed to do. Not just to say it, not just to honor him with your lips, as it says in Scripture, but actually to do it, to be faithful. If you love him, you keep his commandments. So this is just another angle from which to make that point. And in this particular case, to make the point, as we have made many times, that there is this incredible consistency between Old and New Testaments, but even to say that there is this consistency within the arc of human history that forms the context of the Old and New Testaments. Again, this doesn't mean that you can say or do whatever religiously and it's all fine. That is not the point that's being made at all. But rather that those who are truly worshiping the true God are truly worshiping the true God, even if the particulars of the way that they do that and the particulars of the way that they theologize about that show some development over time. So, next time we're going to, as I said, it'll be our 100th episode, our 4th anniversary. So I hope you'll join us. But that is our show for tonight. So thank you for listening, everyone. If you didn't speak with us live, we'd still like to hear from you. You can email us at lordofspirits@ancientfaith.com. You can also send us a message at our Facebook page. You can leave us a voicemail at speakpipe.com/lordofspirits. And if you have basic questions about Orthodox Christianity or you need help in finding a parish, head over to orthodoxintro.org.
And join us for our live broadcast on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays of the month at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. I like the way you walking if you walking my way. I'm that Red Bull. Now let's fly away.
If you're on Facebook, you can follow our page, you can join our discussion group and give us reviews and ratings and share this show with a friend.
And finally, be sure to go to ancientfaith.com/support and help make sure we and lots of other AFR podcasters stay on the air. I see me with her, no Stevie Wonder. She don't ever wonder because she knows she bad. And I got her grocery bag.
Thank you. Good night. God bless you.
You've been listening to The Lord of Spirits with Orthodox Christian priests, Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung, a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. And I beheld, and I heard the voice of many angels round about the throne, and the beasts, and the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power, and riches, and wisdom, and strength, and honor, and glory, and blessing. Revelation chapter 5, verses 11 through 12.